Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process, he does not become a monster. Friedrich Nietzsche.
Every structure of power rests ultimately on a fragile interior space, the minds and hearts of those who obey. Weapons, wealth, and decrees may build the framework of authority, but without emotional allegiance, they remain hollow. The powerful throughout history have known this instinctively. It is not enough to command, one must be believed. The soldiers who march into battle, the citizens who pay their taxes, the disciples who die for an idea, they do so not because they are forced, but because their inner world has been shaped to see that obedience as necessary, moral, or even sacred. To work on the hearts and minds of others is to occupy the deepest territory available to any ruler. Coercion is temporary, conviction is permanent. Fear compels action only while it is felt, but belief sustains behavior even when surveillance ends. When people have been emotionally conditioned to see your cause as their own, they will defend you even against their rational interests. This is why empires that mastered emotional loyalty, from Rome's religious institutions to modern ideological states, have outlasted those that ruled by brute force alone. Fear creates rebellion in silence. Love creates obedience in peace. The psychological structure of human allegiance begins in the need to belong. Every person seeks identification with something larger than themselves, a nation, a faith, a family, a mission. Power exploits that need by offering a role, a narrative, and a purpose that promises meaning. Those who can attach emotion to that promise will always outmaneuver those who rely on logic. A rational argument convinces, an emotional bond converts. When a population feels seen, protected, or elevated by its ruler or ideology, it does not question. It worships. Throughout civilization, this truth has remained constant, though the symbols changed. The tribal chieftain wore feathers and spoke of spirits. The medieval king carried a sword blessed by God. The modern leader invokes equality, freedom, or destiny. The language differs, but the method is identical. Create emotional resonance strong enough to silence inquiry. Those who master this art understand that people rarely seek truth. They seek coherence between what they feel and what they are told. The ruler's task is to align both. Psychologically, devotion operates through identification and dependency. The moment subjects begin to see their own identity reflected in the ruler's image, their autonomy dissolves. They experience his success as their own triumph and his downfall as a personal loss. The leader becomes the mirror through which they understand themselves. This is why demagogues use collective pronouns: we, our struggle, our enemies. The merging of language reinforces the merging of emotion. It removes the distinction between self and authority, creating a sense of shared destiny that feels voluntary but is, in truth, engineered. Behavioral science has confirmed what rulers learned through intuition. Emotion rewires perception faster than reason can correct it. When feelings of pride, belonging, or fear are triggered, the brain prioritizes loyalty to the emotional source over objective reality. Propaganda operates through this channel, but so does charisma. Both rely on repetition, association, and the careful management of contrast. Offering hope against threat, inclusion against isolation. The population is not forced to believe. It is guided toward belief by the emotional architecture built around it. Understanding this mechanism is the difference between power that endures and power that collapses. A tyrant who rules by terror must maintain constant vigilance. The slightest weakness invites revolt. A leader who rules through emotional integration may disappear for decades, yet his image will continue to govern memory and behavior. The devotion to Napoleon survived his exile. The reverence for Lincoln outlived his assassination. Their armies were defeated, but their emotional imprint on collective identity remained. The most effective form of conquest is not territorial. It is psychological. There is also an ethical tension embedded in this law. To influence hearts and minds is to enter the private sanctum of another human being, the domain of conscience and emotion. Power in this sphere can be constructive or corrupt, depending on intent. The same tools used to inspire unity and moral action can be used to create cults and mass delusion. History's greatest manipulators and its most inspiring leaders share the same foundation: mastery of human feeling. The difference lies not in method but in motive. At its core, this law exposes an uncomfortable reality. Most people do not act from knowledge but from emotional alignment. They will believe comforting falsehoods over painful truths, follow charisma over competence, and protect illusions that grant them identity. The powerful understand this and design their influence accordingly. They speak to emotion first, allowing reason to trail behind as justification. Once the emotional connection is secure, facts become irrelevant. The narrative sustains itself. For the seeker of power, this insight offers both opportunity and warning. If you wish to lead, you must learn to engage emotion before intellect. If you wish to remain free, you must guard your emotions more fiercely than your possessions. In every negotiation, every alliance, every movement, remember that the true battlefield is invisible. It exists in perception, belief, and sentiment, the terrain of the human core. Whoever shapes that terrain commands the outcome before a single word or act is made. To rule the mind is to rule the world. To lose your own heart to another's influence is to be ruled forever. Devotion is not born, it is engineered. Every era, every system of authority, from ancient priesthoods to digital empires, has relied on the deliberate construction of emotional allegiance. Power that wishes to endure must learn to replace fear with affection and obedience with belief. To make a person fight, build, or die willingly under your command, you must enter the invisible machinery that dictates how they feel, what they revere, and what they fear. The leader who learns to do this transforms from commander to symbol, from person to myth. The anatomy of devotion begins with narrative. The human mind does not organize reality through data or logic. It organizes it through story. A people without a shared story are a people without cohesion, vulnerable to chaos. The ruler's task is to provide a story that feels redemptive, one that explains the present and promises meaning. It may be political, religious, or moral, but it must answer the same primal question: why do we matter? When a leader crafts an answer to that question and attaches his identity to it, he becomes irreplaceable. The masses may disagree with his actions, but they will defend the story that gives them purpose. To anchor that story, symbols are required. Symbols are emotional shortcuts, images, gestures, or objects that bypass reason and strike directly at memory. Every great power system has understood this. The Roman eagle, the Christian cross, the revolutionary red flag, each condensed entire philosophies into something visual, repeatable, and sacred. Symbols allow emotion to be shared instantly across millions. They are the infrastructure of collective feeling, and they outlive the words that created them. A well-designed symbol can survive centuries after the doctrine it once represented has faded. Ritual gives those symbols rhythm, the repetition of an act, saluting a flag, reciting a creed, attending a weekly ceremony, conditions the body to feel devotion before the mind can question it. The Jesuits, monarchies, and totalitarian regimes alike knew that repetition creates association, and association creates faith. The purpose of ritual is not information but immersion. It gives emotion a predictable shape, making the act of loyalty feel natural, inevitable, even pleasurable. People find comfort in rhythm. The ruler finds control in that comfort. Myth transforms obedience into identity. When a leader's struggle becomes a metaphor for the people's destiny, loyalty becomes self-expression. Napoleon mastered this with calculated precision. He was not content to be seen as a general. He became the personification of French glory. His proclamations were written as theater, his presence carefully staged. Even in defeat, the myth survived because it had fused with national pride. Napoleon's understanding was clear. To rule the heart, you must become part of the emotional landscape people use to define themselves. If they lose you, they lose a fragment of who they believe they are. The Catholic Church achieved a similar triumph over centuries. Its genius was not only theological but psychological. It understood the power of image and repetition long before propaganda had a name. Stained glass, incense, chant, all were tools designed to move emotion beyond intellect. The believer did not merely think of faith, he felt it. The Church thus built the most enduring emotional empire in history, one whose authority rested not on law or conquest, but on the binding of imagination and devotion. Where kings and armies perished, the architecture of feeling remained. Modern rulers and corporations follow the same blueprint. Political movements sell belonging, brands sell identity. A flag, a logo, a slogan all descend from the same lineage of emotional engineering. The mechanism is identical. Present the audience with a void and fill it with a feeling attached to your name. People do not buy products or ideologies. They buy reassurance that they are seen, valued, and significant. When Apple told its followers to think different, it was not describing behavior. It was constructing emotional superiority. Belief became a purchase, and devotion became market share. The art of emotional allegiance depends on a paradox. The more people believe they are acting freely, the tighter the control becomes. A population that believes it has chosen its loyalty will defend it far more ferociously than one coerced into it. This is why manipulation through affection is the most refined and dangerous form of power. It breeds defenders rather than victims. To achieve this, the leader must appear less as a commander and more as a guide. He must give his followers the illusion of participation while ensuring that every emotional outlet leads back to him. Fear still plays a role, but a different one. Pure terror creates submission but not devotion. It silences action rather than inspiring it. The intelligent ruler uses fear as contrast, a shadow that makes love and loyalty appear luminous. When followers are reminded of the chaos, shame, or isolation awaiting them outside the fold, their emotional dependency deepens. The comfort of belonging begins to feel like safety, and safety eventually feels like love. At that point, the individual no longer distinguishes between loyalty and survival. The structure of emotional allegiance, then, is architectural. Narrative provides the foundation, symbols raise the walls, ritual cements the structure, and myth gives it a soul. When all four elements align, the leader's influence no longer requires his presence. The system itself begins to think and feel on his behalf. Generations may pass, governments may fall, but the emotional pattern remains, waiting to be reawakened by another who speaks its language. This is the silent triumph of those who understand law. 43. The greatest conquerors do not storm fortresses, they design them inside the human mind. Their victories cannot be erased by rebellion or revolution because their image has already been absorbed into the emotional logic of their subjects. When hearts and minds are yours, everything else follows naturally. The obedience of hands, the silence of dissent, the rewriting of memory. That is the ultimate prize of power, not the throne but the invisible empire of devotion. Few rulers in history have demonstrated the transformation of power through emotion as completely as Ashoka, the third emperor of the Mauryan dynasty. His reign in the 3rd century BCE began in conquest and ended in conscience. What makes him extraordinary is not the scale of his victories, but the method of his rule after them. He learned through blood that fear can win territory but not loyalty, and that the heart, once conquered, is the most enduring dominion of all. Ashoka inherited an empire forged by war. His grandfather Chandragupta and father Bindusara had carved a vast domain across the Indian subcontinent through tactical brilliance and relentless expansion. But it was Ashoka's own campaign against the kingdom of Kalinga that marked the turning point. Contemporary accounts record over 100,000 dead and many times that displaced. The carnage weighed on him, not as a moment of weakness but as a revelation. For the first time, the emperor saw that ruling by destruction only multiplies resistance. His remorse was not sentimental, it was strategic insight. He understood that a throne built on corpses must forever stand guard, but one built on conviction could endure unguarded. In the years that followed, Ashoka's rule underwent a profound shift. He embraced Buddhism not merely as faith but as statecraft. The pillars and rocks that bore his edicts across the empire were more than moral declarations. They were instruments of psychological governance. Each message spoke of compassion, tolerance, and duty, yet beneath the moral veneer lay an exact calculation: to replace fear with identification. The people who once obeyed from terror were now invited to see their emperor as a moral guide, a paternal figure who shared their conscience. By aligning his image with the highest ethical ideals of the time, Ashoka made resistance feel immoral. This transformation did not weaken his power, it perfected it. His soft empire, as modern scholars describe it, rested on persuasion rather than punishment. He commissioned roads, rest houses, and hospitals. He sent envoys bearing goodwill instead of soldiers bearing swords. The empire became not merely an administrative system but a moral organism, one that reflected the emperor's own transformation. The concept of Dhamma, which he elevated to central doctrine, became a unifying emotional language that transcended region, caste, and tribe. It provided an identity stronger than law, the feeling of shared virtue. Beneath the compassion, however, was a political genius of rare subtlety. Ashoka understood that guilt is among the most powerful instruments of control. By publicly acknowledging his remorse, he placed himself morally above his subjects. The act of confession purified him while binding others to his example. It is difficult to rebel against a ruler who appears to suffer for his own sins. His moral sincerity disarmed opposition more effectively than any army. People who might have resisted taxation or authority instead sought to emulate the emperor's virtue, believing that moral obedience was spiritual progress. Ashoka's new system also reshaped the function of communication. Instead of decrees threatening punishment, his edicts offered reflection. Yet their language was not passive, it was prescriptive. They urged kindness, moderation, respect for authority, and care for all living things. The emperor became the voice of conscience itself. To defy him was no longer to disobey the state, but to offend one's own moral sense. Thus, devotion to the emperor became synonymous with moral purity. It was a masterstroke, rule transformed into a shared ethical project. Through this method, Ashoka achieved something unprecedented. His empire extended over 2 million square miles, yet required minimal coercion. Provincial governors governed themselves through loyalty. Citizens internalized his vision as their own. Even foreign lands recognized the persuasive aura of his rule. In diplomatic inscriptions found as far as modern-day Greece and Afghanistan, he is portrayed not as conqueror, but as enlightener, a rare title for a monarch. His power became psychological diplomacy. influence through reputation. The durability of his empire after his death was limited. No political system survives unchanged, but his emotional architecture outlived him by millennia. The spread of Buddhism across Asia was not simply religious diffusion. It was the continuation of Ashoka's moral empire. His symbols, the wheel, the lion, the lotus, became enduring emblems of unity and righteousness. Even modern India's national emblem bears his mark, proof that emotional power leaves deeper roots than political ones. Ashoka's legacy demonstrates a profound paradox. Softness, when systematized, becomes unbreakable. The ruler who converts guilt into compassion transforms fear into loyalty. His power no longer depends on surveillance or force. It thrives on voluntary imitation. By giving his subjects the illusion of shared morality, Ashoka achieved what no conqueror before him had managed: to make people believe that submission was enlightenment. This was not deception in the crude sense. It was psychological architecture. He reshaped the emotional coordinates through which his people understood good and evil, authority and virtue. In the final analysis, Ashoka's transformation reveals the hidden dimension of Law 43. Emotion as infrastructure. Fear exhausts itself, affection multiplies. The ruler who speaks to conscience builds a citadel no enemy can breach because it exists within every loyal heart. Ashoka's soft empire was, in truth, the hardest kind of power, one that replaced the sword with belief and the battlefield with the human mind. When the Society of Jesus, better known as the Jesuits, was founded in the 16th century, Europe was convulsed by religious war and ideological fragmentation. The Protestant Reformation had fractured the authority of the Catholic Church, and monarchs were scrambling to reassert control over minds as well as territories. It was within this climate of intellectual warfare that Ignatius of Loyola and his companions constructed one of the most sophisticated systems of influence ever devised. They did not build fortresses, they built schools. They did not seek to crush their enemies outright, they sought to educate them. By mastering the hearts and minds of the young elite, they created a network of emotional allegiance that outlasted kingdoms. The Jesuits understood something that few religious orders grasped in such precise psychological terms. Education is the slow conquest of identity. They believed that true power does not come from forcing belief, but from shaping the very framework through which belief becomes possible. Their method was methodical. Each Jesuit school was a microcosm of discipline and devotion. Students rose at dawn, engaged in study, debate, and confession, and ended their day in reflection. The rhythm was designed to weave together intellect and emotion until obedience felt indistinguishable from understanding. By controlling the context in which thought developed, the Jesuits ensured that every conclusion the student reached seemed self-generated, yet it always aligned with Jesuit doctrine. Their curriculum fused rigorous logic with spiritual intimacy. This balance was deliberate. Pure authority breeds rebellion. Pure affection breeds sentimentality. The Jesuits blended the two, creating a model of mentorship that inspired both admiration and dependence. The teacher was not only a figure of knowledge, but of moral and emotional guidance. The student's intellectual progress became tied to the mentor's approval, producing a subtle psychological bond that could last a lifetime. This was devotion reframed as gratitude, a far more durable form of loyalty than fear. In cultivating the hearts of the elite, the Jesuits understood that one loyal prince could be more valuable than 1,000 loyal peasants. Their strategy was long-term. Educate the ruling class, and you educate the future of power itself. Across Europe, from Spain to Poland, Jesuit institutions became breeding grounds for statesmen, scholars, and clerics who carried within them a mental architecture built by the order. Their influence spread quietly through the corridors of power. Monarchs who distrusted the church still entrusted their heirs to Jesuit tutors because no one else could produce such discipline and intellect. Thus, the Society of Jesus embedded itself not only within the church but within the very psychology of European governance. What made their influence so effective was not dogmatism, but subtlety. The Jesuits did not merely teach theology, they taught rhetoric, philosophy, mathematics, and languages. Their students could debate and persuade with precision. Behind this intellectual training lay an emotional purpose. Mastery of the word is mastery of thought, and mastery of thought is mastery of others. Every Jesuit education produced a mind trained to argue but also to yield, to recognize the hierarchy of truth and to submit to it voluntarily. The psychological result was obedience that felt rational, devotion that felt intelligent. It was the perfect synthesis of intellect and faith. Confession and self-examination were central to this system. By teaching young men to scrutinize their thoughts and desires daily, the Jesuits turned introspection into a form of surveillance. The student learned to police his own motives long before external authority intervened. The confessor's role was not punitive but diagnostic. He became the custodian of conscience. Through this mechanism, obedience became self-regulated. The Jesuits had discovered what modern psychologists would later describe as internalized authority, the process by which external control becomes inner voice. Once that voice is installed, it cannot easily be silenced. The order's influence expanded globally through the missionary enterprise. In China, India, and Japan, Jesuits adapted their message to local cultures, mastering languages and customs with anthropological precision. Matteo Ricci's mission to China epitomized this intellectual diplomacy. He presented Christianity not as a foreign imposition but as an extension of Confucian ethics. His mastery of Chinese etiquette won the admiration of scholars and officials alike, allowing him to convert not through confrontation but through cultural resonance. It was Law 43 executed on a civilizational scale. Persuasion through respect, conversion through empathy. The Jesuits knew that to win a culture's heart, one must first reflect its mind. Their eventual expulsion from several European kingdoms in the 18th century did not erase their methods. It proved their success. Kings feared them precisely because their influence was invisible. Armies can be defeated. Education cannot. The pupils they had trained went on to shape politics, literature, and science, carrying Jesuit mental discipline wherever they rose to prominence. Even their suppression by papal decree in 1773 could not destroy the emotional infrastructure they had built. When the order was restored decades later, it re-emerged not as a relic but as a quiet force that had never truly disappeared. The architecture of devotion they constructed was self-sustaining. In the broader history of power, the Jesuits represent the institutional perfection of emotional control through intellect. They proved that the mind can be captured without violence and that love cloaked in discipline is the most persuasive form of domination. Their model survives today in universities, political parties, and ideological movements that educate rather than command. What began as a religious mission evolved into a global system of influence, a living example that the conquest of the classroom precedes the conquest of the world. The Jesuits remind us that education is never neutral. Every lesson carries a motive, every mentor a hierarchy, every moral a direction. Those who shape how people learn shape what people believe, and belief is the raw material of civilization. To work on hearts and minds, therefore, is not merely to persuade, it is to design the emotional logic of entire generations. That was the Jesuit genius. Power that felt like enlightenment, obedience that felt like virtue. Few figures in modern history demonstrate the orchestration of collective emotion as completely as Mao Zedong. Where emperors ruled bodies, Mao sought to rule souls. His revolution was not simply political but psychological. He understood that to reshape China, he would first have to remake the Chinese mind, its emotions, loyalties, and moral reflexes. The result was a regime sustained not by reasoned consent or constant terror, but by a feverish devotion that blurred the line between faith and obedience. Mao's genius and his cruelty lay in his ability to fuse ideology with identity until questioning the party became indistinguishable from betraying oneself. China in the mid-20th century was a country fractured by humiliation and foreign domination. The Qing dynasty had collapsed, warlords and invaders had carved up the land. When Mao emerged as the leader of the communist movement, he did more than promise reform. He promised emotional redemption. He offered the Chinese people a new narrative of dignity, struggle, and rebirth. China has stood up, he declared, and the phrase became a national baptism. It was less a political statement than a psychological cure. For a nation wounded by defeat, Mao provided a feeling of restored worth. That emotional renewal became the foundation of his power. The early years of the People's Republic were built on this emotional scaffolding. Mao did not rely solely on censorship or coercion. He relied on ritual, repetition, and myth. The red flag, the revolutionary songs, the endless posters of smiling peasants, all served the same purpose: to create an atmosphere in which devotion felt natural. Every Chinese citizen was given not only a political duty but a moral role. The peasant who harvested grain, the student who memorized Mao's writings, the worker who joined the production brigades, all participated in a vast moral drama. Mao positioned himself as both author and protagonist of that drama. To love China was to love Mao, and to love Mao was to affirm one's humanity. At the core of this system was the Little Red Book, a compact collection of Mao's quotations that became the portable scripture of the revolution. Every phrase was designed to be emotionally accessible and endlessly repeatable. It was less a text of doctrine than a tool of synchronization, an instrument through which millions could feel united in shared thought. Reciting Mao's words in unison created a rhythm of belonging, transforming ideology into liturgy. Each citizen became both preacher and congregation, reinforcing the illusion that loyalty was self-generated. By memorizing Mao's words, they internalized his voice. Public confession and struggle sessions completed the reprogramming. In the Cultural Revolution, loyalty was proven not through belief but through self-abasement. Citizens were encouraged to denounce others and, more importantly, themselves. These performances of repentance dissolved individuality and installed a collective conscience centered on Mao. Humiliation became a form of purification. Guilt became loyalty. The emotional economy of the regime relied on these psychological exchanges. Fear and love, punishment and redemption merged into one system of control. Mao did not need to imprison every dissident. His followers policed themselves, each terrified of emotional isolation. Mao's image was engineered with precision. The portraits that adorned every wall were designed to radiate warmth and omnipresence. His face was not that of a distant ruler, but of a benevolent father watching and guiding. The result was a strange intimacy between ruler and ruled, one that bypassed logic entirely. People wept when they saw him, fainted in his presence, carried his image in parades as if it were sacred relic. The boundary between politics and religion disappeared. The party became a church, Mao its messiah, and revolution its gospel. This emotional reprogramming achieved something no prior dynasty had managed. It created a population whose primary loyalty was psychological rather than familial or regional. The individual's moral compass was recalibrated to align with collective emotion. Traditional virtues, filial piety, moderation, self-reflection, were replaced by new emotional reflexes: enthusiasm, struggle, sacrifice. Mao's control reached beyond obedience into the domain of feeling. Even after his disastrous policies led to famine and death, millions continued to revere him, unable to separate personal faith from national identity. This was not delusion in the usual sense, it was emotional conditioning sustained over decades. The power of Mao's emotional system was its self-perpetuation. Children were raised in schools that taught loyalty as morality. Art and literature served as emotional instruction manuals. Music and slogans trained the nervous system itself to respond to ideological cues. By the time of the Cultural Revolution, belief in Mao had become reflexive, a physiological habit. To doubt him was to experience guilt. To praise him was to feel relief. That is the final stage of emotional conquest, when obedience ceases to feel like submission and begins to feel like virtue. Even after his death in 1976, the psychic residue of Mao's rule remained. His image continues to hang in Tiananmen Square, not because the people fear him, but because his emotional architecture still frames their idea of authority. The party that succeeded him learned to preserve his symbols while softening his methods, maintaining stability through a quieter version of emotional alignment. The rituals of belief had evolved, but the underlying psychology remained. Unity achieved through feeling rather than freedom. Mao's legacy, stripped of ideology, reveals the central mechanism of Law 43. He understood that no system can survive by intellect alone. It must root itself in emotion. Reason can be debated, but emotion must be lived. By turning politics into faith, Mao achieved what armies and propaganda alone could not: a nation that felt its obedience. He replaced coercion with communion, making the act of surrender indistinguishable from love. In the history of psychological governance, Mao stands as both architect and warning. He demonstrated that hearts and minds once captured can sustain tyranny without chains. The tools of devotion he perfected, myth, ritual, guilt, and unity, remain the blueprint for all who wish to rule through emotion. He proved that the true revolution does not happen in the streets, it happens in the nervous system of a nation. If the mastery of emotion is the art of power, then the defense of one's own emotions is the art of freedom. Every age that has produced great manipulators has also produced those who refuse to be remade, men and women who learn to preserve the sovereignty of their inner world. They are fewer in number, but their resistance defines the limits of tyranny. To work on the hearts and minds of others is to construct an invisible prison. To defend one's own mind is to refuse the architecture entirely. It is the difference between living under influence and living by awareness. The first line of defense is recognition. Influence works best when it goes unnoticed. Emotional manipulation conceals itself behind moral language, collective ideals, and comforting stories. Once identified, it loses much of its strength. Every dictator, demagogue, or movement cloaks its intent in emotional appeal. Love of nation, purity of faith, the promise of safety or progress. The antidote is not cynicism but clarity. To see that emotion when organized by others is a form of ownership. Those who can name the emotion being used against them begin to reclaim control over it. Throughout history, those who have resisted manipulation did so not by counter-ideology, but by cultivating inner independence. The Stoics of ancient Rome understood this instinctively. Surrounded by imperial propaganda and the constant theater of public loyalty, they turned inward. For thinkers like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, true freedom resided in governing one's own responses, not the world itself. To them, emotion was not to be repressed, but mastered, filtered through reason until no external power could command it. Their philosophy was not political, yet it became the most subversive form of politics. A declaration that the self is a kingdom no ruler can invade. Solitude, too, serves as a shield. Emotional contagion thrives in crowds. The human nervous system mirrors what it sees. Outrage breeds outrage, adoration breeds adoration. The powerful exploit this through rallies, media, and collective rituals. Solitude interrupts the transmission. It allows the individual to reset the nervous system, to separate authentic feeling from orchestrated emotion. Many of history's independent minds, from monks to dissidents to scientists, discovered their strength in withdrawal. Isolation gave them perspective, and perspective gave them immunity. Another tool of defense is skepticism, though not the shallow skepticism of denial, but a disciplined habit of questioning motive. When faced with messages designed to inspire devotion or fear, the question, "Who benefits from my emotion?" becomes armor. Every movement that demands love or hatred is in essence demanding ownership of the heart. Those who can trace emotional demand back to its source see manipulation for what it is, an attempt to rewrite moral reflexes for another's gain. The habit of skepticism does not kill conviction, it purifies it, allowing belief to emerge from choice rather than coercion. Cultural memory also plays a crucial role in resistance. Societies that forget how easily emotion can be engineered are doomed to repeat the same cycle of enchantment and betrayal. The 20th century alone offers countless reminders. The hypnotic chants of rallies, the moral intoxication of revolutions, the seductive certainty of ideological purity. Nations that teach their citizens to remember how those spells were cast cultivate collective antibodies against future manipulation. Education, when done honestly, functions not as indoctrination but as inoculation. There is also a moral dimension to defending one's mind. Power often presents manipulation as benevolence. It claims to protect, to uplift, to guide. Resisting this requires the courage to tolerate uncertainty, to live without the comfort of total answers. The psychologically free person accepts ambiguity, knowing that absolute belief is often the first symptom of control. Emotional independence demands a willingness to endure doubt, to stand alone in the storm of collective feeling. This is not detachment born of apathy but of integrity. It is the refusal to trade inner freedom for social harmony. History offers examples of such resistance. Václav Havel, the Czech dissident who defied Soviet domination, spoke of living in truth. To live in truth, he said, is to reject the emotional theater of totalitarianism. The slogans, the rituals, the lies that everyone pretends to believe. His revolution began not in streets but in the conscience of individuals who refused to act out the script. Similarly, Alexander Solzhenitsyn survived the Gulag by preserving an inner world untouched by propaganda. Their defiance was not loud, but it was absolute. They could not be emotionally occupied. The power that relies on belief collapses the moment people stop feeling it. In the digital age, emotional manipulation has grown more refined, yet more pervasive. Algorithms now perform the same work that priests and propagandists once did, identifying desires, amplifying fears, and feeding users the emotions most likely to bind them to a product, ideology, or tribe. The battle for the human heart no longer happens in public squares but in screens and feeds. The same principles apply. Those who understand how emotion is manufactured retain agency. Those who don't mistake stimulation for truth. Emotional literacy has become a survival skill. Ultimately, defending the mind requires what can only be called emotional discipline. It is the deliberate practice of feeling deeply without surrendering judgment. It does not mean living without passion, but ensuring passion serves thought rather than replaces it. The powerful thrive on polarization because it simplifies the world into loyalty and treason. The free individual resists this reduction. He can admire without worship, criticize without hatred, belong without surrendering identity. Emotional discipline, properly understood, is not coldness, it is sovereignty. Law 43 teaches the mechanics of influence, but it also reveals the path to independence. To work on the hearts and minds of others is to build invisible walls. To defend your own is to walk through them. In an age when every institution, advertisement, and ideology competes for emotional allegiance, the highest form of power may not be to command others, but to remain uncommanded within. Freedom, in its purest form, is emotional self-possession. Once that is secured, every manipulator, however skillful, finds their influence dissolved in silence. Every empire that endures, every movement that transcends its founder, achieves the same invisible goal. It builds an emotional structure sturdy enough to outlive its creator. Power that survives the decay of armies and the fall of buildings is never physical. It is psychological. The ruler who truly grasps this law ceases to think like a commander and begins to think like an architect. He designs patterns of belief, rituals of feeling, and symbols of belonging that continue to shape human behavior long after his body is turned to dust. This is the hidden legacy of Law 43, power through psychological architecture. To construct such architecture is to recognize that the mind is a social material. Thoughts and feelings, when repeated across generations, form structures as real as stone. Religions, nations, ideologies, even families rely on this silent scaffolding. Every prayer, anthem, or creed is a brick, every ritual a beam, every shared emotion the mortar that holds them together. What differentiates ordinary authority from enduring power is the degree to which it becomes self-sustaining. The ruler who understands emotion as design builds a world that governs itself. The ancients understood this instinctively. The Egyptian pharaohs carved devotion into stone, embedding theology in architecture itself. The pyramids were not only tombs but psychological monuments, vast affirmations of divine continuity meant to condition awe in every generation that followed. The empire may have collapsed, but the emotional design remained, visible even now. The same principle governed the later empires of faith. Islam's call to prayer echoing across centuries, the rhythmic gestures of Catholic liturgy, the coded humility of Confucian ritual. Each transformed feeling into infrastructure. Their survival cannot be explained by doctrine alone. It lies in the precision of their emotional engineering. Modern politics follows the same logic, though clothed in different language. Constitutions, national myths, revolutionary songs. These are not merely civic tools but emotional blueprints. The American founders, for instance, understood that the republic would require mythic sentiment as much as legal order. We hold these truths to be self-evident was not a statement of fact but an act of enchantment. A moral incantation designed to bind reason to feeling. The idea of liberty, elevated to sacred principle, became an emotional foundation that made rebellion feel righteous and government feel moral. Centuries later, the same words continue to command allegiance not through fear, but through sentiment embedded in identity. The most subtle architects of power know that emotion must always appear spontaneous, never designed. The moment people sense manipulation, devotion decays. Thus, the art lies in concealment, in creating emotional frameworks that feel organic, inevitable, even divine. Ashoka's edicts appeared as moral reflection, not policy. The Jesuits disguised obedience as enlightenment. Mao's cult emerged as collective enthusiasm, not decree. The greatest manipulators never announce their methods. They allow love, loyalty, and guilt to do their work in silence. Architecture, once complete, no longer needs the builder. For those who study power, the lesson is both awe-inspiring and cautionary. Influence constructed through emotion cannot be dismantled by logic. It resists argument because it lives deeper than reason. One can disprove an idea but not a feeling. That is why revolutions that destroy symbols and institutions often fail to erase the psychology behind them. The fallen statue is only a fragment of the system that produced it. The real monument stands within the collective mind. Destroying emotional architecture requires replacing it with something equally compelling. A new story, a new ritual, a new moral gravity. Otherwise, the old structure quietly rebuilds itself from memory. For individuals, understanding this principle is essential for self-preservation. To live among such architectures without being consumed by them is the test of maturity. One must learn to navigate between them. To feel the beauty of belonging without surrendering discernment. To participate in collective emotion without becoming possessed by it. The emotionally literate person recognizes that every society builds illusions because illusions are necessary. But necessity does not equal truth. Power's architecture provides stability, yet freedom requires knowing where the walls end. Ultimately, Law 43 is less about manipulation than about design. It reveals that emotion, when organized deliberately, becomes the foundation of civilization itself. Those who wield it irresponsibly create cults. Those who understand its balance create cultures. The difference lies in intention, whether one seeks to awaken the mind or to occupy it. The ethical ruler, the wise leader, or even the enlightened individual uses emotional architecture not to enslave, but to harmonize, to build order without violence, unity without blindness. That ideal remains rare, but it defines the highest form of mastery. Every century rewrites this law in new materials, words, screens, algorithms. Yet its essence remains unchanged. Whoever shapes the emotional climate shapes the course of history. The generals of the future will not fight with weapons but with atmospheres, moods, narratives, and symbols calibrated to control the human spirit. The battlefield will be invisible, its victories measured in allegiance rather than territory. In the end, the power to work on the hearts and minds of others is both divine and dangerous. It is the power to build invisible worlds that people willingly inhabit. The wise approach it with restraint, the reckless with appetite. But whether used for tyranny or enlightenment, its truth is immutable. The deepest form of rule is not over land or law, but over perception itself. When a person or an idea becomes the lens through which others see reality, they have already won. And so the final insight stands. To rule bodies is temporary. To rule minds is lasting. But to design the emotions through which minds perceive the world, that is immortality. Like, subscribe, comment, or don't. You are the master of your own life.